All right, well, welcome to this lecture series on modern macroeconomics and our emphasis on new classical macroeconomics. In this lecture, what we're going to see is a bunch of different kind of smaller sub-schools of thought within new classical macro. Much of new classical macroeconomics is associated with what is called freshwater economics. It's associated with the Chicago School of Economics and that kind of neoclassical standard microeconomic tradition. This is in contrast to the kind of coastal schools that focus a little bit more on new Keynesian ideas, and thus we get the idea of kind of the saltwater schools. So new classical is kind of seen as the freshwater schools. You may hear that terminology from time to time. One particular subgroup within the freshwater schools of thought, or the new classical schools of thought, is what we covered in the last video, where we talked about real business cycle theory. So unlike other leading theories of the business cycle, real business cycle theory sees business cycle fluctuations as the efficient response to exogenous changes in the real economic environment. According to real business cycle theory, business cycles are real in that they do not represent a failure of markets to clear, but rather they reflect the most efficient possible operation of the economy, given the structure of the economy and the shocks that have hit it. That is, the level of national output necessarily maximizes expected utility, and governments should therefore concentrate on long-run structural policy changes, not intervening through discretionary fiscal or monetary policy, not intervening in such a way that's designed to actively smooth out economic short-term fluctuations, the business cycle. Somewhat of a subdivision within real business cycle theory is supply-side economics. Supply-side macroeconomics is really a theory that argues that economic growth can best or most effectively be created by lowering taxes and decreasing regulation. It's directly opposed to Keynesian kind of demand side economics. According to supply side economics, with lower taxes and reduced regulation, consumers are the ones who benefit from a greater supply of goods and services at lower prices, and employment will increase, right? The economy will do the best it can, so to speak. Supply-side econ's main emphasis is that increased taxation steadily reduces economic trade and it discourages investment. So why the emphasis on taxes? Why do high tax rates diminish output? Well, we have a number of reasons according to the supply-siders. First, higher taxes discourage work. It discourages effort to produce, right? And so if you're taxed more, you're going to kind of provide less effort towards your production because you're going to reap less of the rewards from these things. Also, we have this idea that we will have slower capital formation. Foreign investors are going to look elsewhere when there's high taxation within your country. Domestic investors look for non-profit making investments, relatively speaking, right? So there's some trade-offs where they might look for non-profit making investments. They might go to hobby businesses instead because they're not going to be taxed as much. Or they might kind of go to charitable contributions or different things with their capital that they have, with the money that they have to invest in capital formation. And then the last thing is that we might substitute more towards tax deductible options and not optimize productivity and efficiency. So we might kind of do things that are basically because they are tax write-offs. Again, you can think of like charitable contributions or things like that here, but there's also different ways that you can create your business such that you have kind of more tax deductible options. And that might not be done in such a way that optimizes productivity. If it was optimizing productivity, why wouldn't we be doing that already anyway, right? And so we could see kind of these high tax rates discouraging or diminishing output by limiting our effort, reducing our capital formation, and substituting kind of where we put our money within the economy. So for supply-siders, taxes act as a type of trade barrier, so to speak, that causes participants to revert to less efficient means of satisfying their needs. There's a tax is going to get in the way of an exchange taking place. right? Higher taxes reduce exchange, so we can kind of think of it as a trade barrier, a cost of exchange, right? Specialization and thus overall economic efficiency is going to decrease when we have this additional cost to our exchange. The Laffer curve is one of the main theoretical constructs of supply-side economics, right? And to get the idea of what the Laffer curve is going to say, we want to think about two extremes here. So the Laffer curve was invented by Arthur Laffer, kind of modernized and put forward by Arthur Laffer. And what he basically argues is, well, think about different tax rates and the amount of revenue that is generated from those tax rates. If we have a zero tax rate, how much revenue are we going to create? Well, none, right? We have no taxes going on, so there's going to be no tax revenue. But think about the other extreme. What if we have a 100% tax rate? How much are you going to work if there's a 100% tax rate on your work? Likely you're not going to work at all, right? There's no reason to. You're not going to reap any of your rewards. You're not going to do anything that is considered work and a taxable income, right? And so we get zero revenue there as well. Well, shoot, we do get some revenue with different tax rates. So we need to think about how the different tax rates impact the actual revenue generated. And we need to think about it not as just, oh, well, a higher tax rate creates more tax revenue. So let's break down the Laffer curve here. All right, so on this graph, we can see a lower tax rate, T1, creating some tax revenue, R1, right? The vertical axis here is our tax revenue collected, and the horizontal axis of our Laffer curve is the tax rate that we're charging. So if you start at T1, you would get R1 revenue. And then we could think about raising the tax rate to T2. When we raise the tax rate to T2, we raise the revenue also. We're increasing the overall burden of taxes from T1 to T2 and getting a rise in total tax revenue. That seems pretty straightforward. That's our normal interpretation of things. In this graph, what we see is a very important point here, T3. At point T3, we're kind of hitting this tipping point where if we raised taxes any more beyond T3, we would actually be reducing the tax revenue collected, right? So if we go from T2 up to T3, yeah, we're increasing the tax revenue. We're going to have more tax revenue than R2. However, if we move out to tax rate 4, we can see that we actually are generating less tax revenue, right? Under certain circumstances, lifting the tax rate to T4 might lead to a reduction in tax revenue, right? And we saw that with our extreme example. If we had a 100% tax rate, the revenue we're going to generate is going to be really low or zero or close to it, right? And this is just kind of showcasing this set of trade-offs. And so we can think about these Laffer curve policies as saying, hey, you know, sometimes we might be at such a high tax rate that actually reducing the tax rate is not only good for the supply side of the economy, but it might actually generate more revenue. We might be on the right side of the curve. And even if that's not the case, as was kind of originally pushed forward, we might be near the peak of the curve, and so reducing the tax rate really doesn't reduce the revenue collected as much as we might think it would, right? Whereas if we get really far to the left side of the curve, closer to T1 and T2, a reduction in the tax rate is really going to drop the tax revenue generated. And so the new classical macroeconomists that are supply-siders focused on taxation use the idea of the Laffer curve to talk about taxation and the importance of, you know, what tax rates we actually have and how does that play out for the economy at large. And then finally here we have the new classical idea of Ricardian equivalence, right? This becomes prominent in some new classical circles. The idea is that expansionary fiscal policy has little to no effect because households anticipate higher future taxes that might result from the national debt that is caused by the expansionary fiscal policy. And thus households reduce their spending now. They know they're going to have to pay for it eventually, so they lower their spending now. Budget deficits, spending more in the government now than we're currently taxing, is merely substituted for. Future taxes are going to be a part of our life, and so we substitute future taxes in our expectations for current taxes. Ricardian equivalence remains very controversial, however, because it depends completely on really strict rational expectation theory assumptions. And the public's foresight and grasp of the fiscal system, well, it's not always the strongest. And so there's some debatable assumptions here about the incidence of taxation and expenditure as well, but the basic idea that the Ricardian equivalence concept could have some impact is something that new classical macroeconomists are going to continue to put forward. All right, so that wraps up our various kind of subcomponents of new classical macroeconomics, or our sub-schools that emphasize real shocks or the supply side or Ricardian equivalence. If you want to learn more, we're going to talk next about creating an environment for growth, the importance to new classical macro of institutions. Click on the video to find the next lecture.